Thank you guys all for joining today. We're really glad to have each of you here for the trauma-focused ABA CEU webinar brought to you by TherapyBrands. I'm Brent Roden. It's my joy as the Director of Marketing for our ABA software suite to welcome you all here and tell you a little bit more about TherapyBrands. We are a leading therapy technology partner for many therapy specialties, not just, but also including ABA. And we're really proud to provide purpose-built solutions that support ABA, Catalyst for data collection, and Web ABA for practice management billing. Both of these platforms were created in partnership with BCBAs like yourselves to aid practitioners and practices in ABA-specific scheduling, billing, insurance, unit utilization, data collection, and much more. These platforms are well integrated to provide a full suite of solutions to ABA practices for reducing the administrative burdens that can hinder you from better serving your clients. I'd like to invite you all to stick around after the main presentation for a brief demo of Catalyst by Angela Tabiri, another of our on-staff BCBAs. And at any point, if you are interested in learning more about these platforms or TherapyBrands in general, just drop that note in the chat, or there'll be a poll later in the event where you can indicate that interest. Now let's quickly cover how today's CEU certification will be provided. For those of you who've been with us before, this will come as no surprise, but at the end of the event, within the next day, you will then receive a post-webinar email. This is going to have a link to the recording of the presentation, links to some free resources, and also a link to the form where you apply to get your CEU credit. In that form, you'll enter the date that you watched the webinar and your BCBA certificate number. If you're watching live right now, you'll mark that you attended online synchronous, but if you're watching this later as a recording, put online asynchronous and the date that you watched the event, not the date that it was recorded. During this webinar, we're going to call out 2 secret words. Allison Milam will pop on here. She'll come on the screen and she'll share those words, one in the middle and one more towards the end. We'll make sure that you guys have a chance to capture those words, but make sure you have a notepad or your phone or something handy so that you can take them down. You'll need to enter those 2 secret words in that form and click submit, and then the certificate will be emailed to you. If you have any problems receiving your certificate, you can reply to that post-webinar email and we'll help out. All right, we really appreciate our speaker today, Timothy Folley. Tim and his wife, Marianne, are raising 3 boys not here, but there in Limington, Maine. He earned his master's in Ed Psych from University of Southern Maine in 2014 and has been a BCBA for over 8 years now. In his early career, he worked with a lot of children presenting not only with autism, but also with trauma and attachment disorders. At that same time, he was diagnosed himself with PTSD. Tim's lived experiences in both his personal and professional lives have given him such a unique perspective, and we're really fortunate to have him here speaking to us today. Thanks for being here, Tim. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is amazing. To have this opportunity to talk to this many people. So thank you to the TherapyBrand folks. This has been awesome. I kind of tell a little more about my story. I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2017, excuse me. And while I was going through that process, I was extremely interested in how it worked. In other words, how am I getting better? And so I'll tell you what we didn't talk about was schedules of reinforcement and sort of the typical functions like attention and escape. Yes, there were aspects of that, but we really delved into why. Why did I want to escape that particular situation and that. And so we did a lot of somatic work. And so that's, the sensory component, but again, why, what's happening in terms of respondent conditioning and the biology of all that good stuff. So I've sort of been on this journey for the last, 6-7 years. And it's sort of come to this moment. So thank you again. So let's get started. Excuse me. So here's kind of the outline of what we'll talk about. And to be honest with you, all of these things in and of themselves could be a whole graduate course. So my goal here today is to really just start a conversation about sort of a new way to look, or a different way to look at behavior. And this is kind of how I came to this lens, this trauma and attachment lens. So we'll bridge the gap between operant and sort of classical respondent conditioning, which will lead us to something called the concept cell. And that will take us to something called the theory of construction of motion by Lisa Feldman Barrett down in Northeastern. And so the theory of constructed emotion is really sort of predicated on this predictive processing of the brain. And so how that predictive processing led Dr. Barrett to come to this theory of constructed emotion. I'll kind of talk to you a little about sort of my definition of how the brain makes meaning based on these things that I'll talk about to you. And then briefly, we'll talk about habit reversal training and how I use that with the folks I serve. And then hopefully we'll have a couple chances for some questions. So let's get into it. Excuse me. So bridging the gap. So just take a look here. We have the unconditioned stimuli, conditioned stimuli, unconditioned response, conditioned response, right? So we're going to use the example of a dog bite. So the unconditioned stimulus in that moment would be the dog bite, right? You don't have to learn to be, to pull away from a dog bite, right? You don't have to learn that. So that the unconditioned response there is maybe withdrawal and the feeling of fear. That feeling is going to be really, really important as we move forward. So the feeling of fear. So now a conditioned stimulus, if a conditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, a picture of a dog will if it's paired, will eventually sort of elicit the same response as the dog bite. So a conditioned response will then be the feeling of fear, even perhaps withdrawing from the picture, right? So let's see. So how do we develop a fear response to stimuli we've never been in contact with? Which is really, when I sort of look back a little, I believe Skinner kind of started with work on in respondent conditioning. And this is a guess, I have no idea, but I feel like probably like that was the issue, is how do these sort of flourish and create these networks of stimuli that elicit this fear response. So let's talk a little about second order conditioning. Okay, so or higher order conditioning. So we're presenting the conditioned stimuli, right? So if we go back to the original example, now the conditioned stimuli, the first conditioned stimuli 1 is a picture of a dog. So if that's paired with a mailbox, say, that's your conditioned stimuli, the second one. And in theory, the second stimuli will also elicit the fear response. But here's the deal, right? Pavlov tried to figure this out. And so when he did the second order, so the mailbox in this case, it was about as 50% as strong as the first order CR. In other words, it didn't last as long. It lasts 50%. And so the third order was very, very weak. And the fourth order, he couldn't go past 4 conditioned stimuli. It wasn't going to work. Okay, where do we go from there, right? So if we're talking, if go back to my experiences, and we have this feeling of fear, and the language that we're using, operant language, classical conditioning language, right? that can't, it only goes so far. So where do we go from here? So let's see. So we talk about, so this was the next thing, right? Where do we go from here? The second order. And there's other things, right? There's generalization, but even that doesn't help, right? A CR or operant behavior is elicited, evoked by a stimulus similar to the original condition stimulus, right? But that doesn't explain why maybe a client had, was abused by her father, and a man she's never met elicits the fear response. That doesn't explain that, right? A man who doesn't look like her father, or maybe even a paperclip, right, elicits the fear response. A paperclip has nothing to do with the father. They don't look the same. Generalization there doesn't work. So there's preconditioning, the initial pairing of two stimuli, which will enable one of the stimuli to elicit the conditioned response without being paired with the unconditioned response. So even in that scenario, again, you're stuck back with, you can only go so far with conditioning multiple conditioned stimuli. After the fourth, you can't go any further. So in other words, there doesn't seem to be a respondent procedure that will allow for this to happen. So again, where do we go from here? Well, if you know a little about relational frame theory, and specifically arbitrary applicable relational responding, you'll know that it explains, so stimulus equivalence, right? Back in, I believe, the 70s, or no, sorry, in the 90s, is physically, it pairs physically dissimilar stimuli, and they become related in the absence of training, right? So Sidman in 94 did this. So AARR explains patterns of fear responses that are formed without any observable contextual cues, right? In other words, how does a paperclip elicit the same response that an abusive father would? How? So when the function of a stimulus changes based on its relationship to other stimuli, the transformation of stimulus function has occurred. If the stimulus is a conditioned stimulus that elicits the fear response, then other stimuli in that network will also elicit the fear response. So again, an abusive father and a paperclip become a part of the same network, and are related. Okay, so that's cool. So we at least have a mechanism for bridging the gap between, may not be the only one, but there is a mechanism for bridging the gap between sort of responding conditioning and operant conditioning. And it seems to be one answer could be this arbitrary applicable relational responding. Okay, cool. So now what? Well, if you kind of dig into the relational frame theory literature, what you'll see is that this arbitrary applicable relational responding is how we create concepts, right? So if we go back to the original scenario with the dog bite and the feeling of fear becomes a part of your concept of a dog. So in using the RFT language, the relational network or concept. So the fear response becomes a part of your concept of a dog. So that's really cool. So again, I wanted to know more about, like, okay, this feeling, where does this all come from? The feelings in your body, right? So if we're we're talking about the abusive father and the paperclip and the feeling of fear, right? Then that might become a part of the same concept. So, so I sort of dove more into like emotions and the feelings in your body. Oh, sorry, but before I get there, let's talk a little about the concept cell, which is really cool. Um, so the concept cell, these guys, I believe they were in Utah. They're neurosurgeons, and they're working on patients with epilepsy. And while they were doing surgery, these patients agreed to be a part of this research study. And what they did was they essentially were measuring a single cell's firing response to different stimuli. And what they found was that this one cell would fire when it saw Jennifer Aniston. So it became the Jennifer Aniston cell. Maybe you've heard of the grandmother cell. It's the same idea. And so the idea is, so what was happening is this cell would fire whenever any picture of Jennifer Aniston would come up. And it didn't matter what orientation she was, if it was a profile, if it was she was smiling, if she was upset, if she was running or walking, whatever, it would fire whenever Jennifer Aniston came up. So it's sort of this idea of like, okay, well, there's a concept of Jennifer Aniston, right? And it didn't respond to anything else really, except for Lisa Kudrow, who, if you know, she was a co-star with Jennifer Aniston on the show Friends. So maybe the sort of thinking was, well, maybe this was a Friends concept cell or something to that nature. So they did more research, and in another patient, the cell would fire when they saw a picture of Halle Berry, and even when when the written name Halle Berry was presented, and when the spoken word Halle Berry was presented. Which, if you kind of go back to our concept, right? So that's sort of an example that is used a lot is, the dog, the written word dog, the spoken word dog, and a picture of a dog that's creating the concept. When we talk about relational frame theory, oftentimes that's used to help explain that to folks who are new to that idea. So, and another neuron fired to pictures of Luke Skywalker, the name written on a screen, the spoken word, and also to Yoda, right? So again, we're starting to build concepts, right? And so there is, the point is there is a neural representation of relational frame theory and arbitrary applicable relational responding, which is like, wow, that's amazing, right? But okay, so how does these concepts come about? Like, how do you learn these concepts? So again, a neural representation of RFT, right? So we talk a little bit about where these concepts come from. Well, and I'm also interested in these concepts, where these concepts come from, and I'm also interested in affect, right, and the feelings in your body. So at the same time, I'm thinking about these things, I come across Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, The Theory of Constructed Emotion, and here is the gist of her work, and it's really fascinating. So she's done all this, or all of her early work was trying to find out the fingerprint. That's the language she used, the fingerprint of emotions. In other words, where is the fear region of in the brain, and the happy region in the brain? And there must be some patterns, physiological patterns in the peripheral nervous system, heart rate and skin conductance and all that good stuff. There must be some patterns that you can find so that you can teach emotions. Well, here's the interesting thing is she didn't find any. So, and in her work, she did a lot of work on sort of redoing the experiments that had done in the past that suggest that there is emotional regions of the brain. And what she came to the conclusion that variation is the norm. There is no fingerprint. There is no fingerprint in facial expressions. There is no fingerprint in neural patterns. There is no fingerprint in peripheral nervous system. She cannot find a fingerprint for emotions, which is, again, like pretty wild. So she sort of did a lot of this work, and so she started to think, okay, well, what's happening here? If variation is the norm, what is actually happening? If I can't find any patterns in the biology of humans that will explain emotions, how are emotions created, constructed? And emotions are concepts. So again, we've been talking about concepts right along, right? So emotions are concepts that include interoception and is based on predictive processing. So what is interoception? A quick definition: any movement of your body includes movement in your body. To run from a dog, the heart will pump faster, the lungs will expand and contract with more capacity, and your blood vessels dilate to get glucose to your muscles faster. The corresponding feelings are called interoception. So whenever you move, the feelings in your body is your internal environment, essentially preparing for sort of external behavior, right? Okay, so how are these concepts formed, and what is predictive processing? Oh, here's the secret word.
Tim, are you able to hear me? Oh, sorry. Can't hear you now. Okay. Whatever reason. The secret word, number one, is stimuli. STIMULI. Stimuli is our first secret word. Tim, I'm going to hand it right back to you. Thank you, guys.
Sure. Thank you. So this is it's a good place to stop. Or to just sort of kind of recap before we go any further. So when we go to respondent conditioning, we're bridging the gap using arbitrary applicable relational responding, and AARR is how, in behavioral terms, we learn concepts. Some of these concepts include the feelings in our body. And then we also discovered, we also talked about the concept cell, which is a neural representation of this arbitrary applicable relational responding. So, okay, we have this concept cell. So now we're moving forward. So predictive processing, right? So Dr. Barrett, she based her whole theory of the theory of constructed emotion on predictive processing. And here, I'll be honest, here's where I struggle a lot, because for one, it's not how I was taught, right? We were taught the stimulus response language. It's also sort of a little difficult to stomach for some folks, because the way the brain works doesn't align with stimulus response. And that can be hard for us as a group, us as individuals, to kind of not want to, say you're wrong, but so I'm just presenting some facts for us, and we can kind of, hopefully this starts a conversation. We can dig through these, and it furthers the conversation. So, Nadeja, this is just a quick little 2 or 3 minute video, and it's Dr. Barrett discussing how the brain makes concepts. A quick down and dirty version.
Imagine a bunch of neurons firing in some pattern. Now along comes a smaller group of neurons that are a little better connected to one another, and they say, we can represent this pattern a little more efficiently. And so they do. And let's imagine this happens for every sense that you have: seeing, hearing, touching, and so on. So in this example, I've only depicted 3 different senses. This sort of thing happens all the time in your brain for efficiency. So smaller and smaller groups of neurons summarize what other neurons are doing. Eventually, a few big honking neurons represent all of these other summaries together at the front of the brain. They summarize actually an entire cascade. So you've got this pattern of neurons and smaller neurons firing, and then some other neurons summarize that pattern, and then some other neurons actually summarize that pattern, and so on and so forth. Fewer neurons being used each time. This is actually how the brain works, and we call this learning. When the brain predicts, the cascade is actually playing out in reverse. The biggest, best connected neurons launch predictions, each of which has a cascade into finer and finer and finer predictions as groups of smaller and smaller and smaller neurons all along the way fire in a different pattern, until the cascade reaches the sensory and motor regions of your cortex, which actually have the smallest neurons of all. So a simulation is one big cascade of predictions. As it turns out, everything you see, hear, taste, and feel comes from these massive cascades of predictions. Your brain is launching thousands of these cascades of simulation in every moment, and some of them create emotions.
So I'll explain a little more about what was happening. So let's see. So here's how we build concepts in the brain. And here's what Dr. Barrett was talking about. So imagine the stop sign as being the concept cell similar to the Jennifer Aniston cell, right? So in the outer circle of this sort of bullseye concentric circles is there are something called selective cells. And selective cells fire to very specific stimuli in all of the different sensory systems. So for example, there is one cell that will, so if you look sort of to the left, there's a couple lines, right? There is a cell that will fire to only that orientation of a line, right? There is a cell in the auditory system that will only fire to the sound s, and another to t, right? There is a cell that will only, fire to specific pressure on the skin, right? And they're called selective cells. Well, what Dr. Barrett is talking about is in the theory of constructed emotion is that the interoception in our body is no different. It's just another set of stimuli. It's nothing more than that. So there's selective cells that only fire to, I'm making this up at this point, but say a specific blood pressure, or something like that, or a specific heart rate. And so all of these selective cells then move into, or are then represented by the next layer in the brain. So, for example, perhaps you have the lines on the left-hand side of the circle and the sounds, and there's a cell in the brain that when you see the shape of an octagon, or excuse me, octagon, the shape of an octagon and the sound, then that there's a cell that represents that. Excuse me. And so this just continues on and on and on until you get to the concept cell. And the concept cell in this case is a stop sign, right? And so the stop sign, the concept of a stop sign also includes the movement of your muscles. So if you look sort of in the blue circle just before you get to the stop sign, there's a leg. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a leg pressing on a pedal, right? So the leg pressing on the pedal is a part of the concept of a stop sign. And so in the theory of constructed emotion, what Dr. Barrett is saying is what she's done is she's separated out the interoceptive part of a concept. And so your interoceptive, pattern, for lack of a better word, to a stop sign is different than mine. And essentially we're labeling, let's say we're late for work, right? And the feelings in your body are going to be different than the feelings in my body. And we call them emotions. So it's hard to wrap your head around, and I continue to struggle with it. But this is where I think we should be headed. So let's talk more. So this is the prediction, the predictive part, which again is still difficult. So there's this bottom up, they call it, right, where you're going from the receptors, the sensory receptors in the peripheral nervous system. So, your eyes, your ears, all that stuff. And that's flowing toward the concept cells. There's another mechanism that, again, I struggle with, but there's another mechanism that goes top down. And essentially at some point they're going to meet and they're going to kind of, mull it over. Like, okay, is the incoming sensory input matching the concept that we think is happening? And then there's the brain makes a few choices in that. So, in this example, this would be a prediction error, right? So if the brain is predicting, that someone's talking about a stop sign, and so it's moving down, and then the sensory input is maybe the sound d and right? And for drop, then at some point the brain has to then make some decisions. There's a prediction error, right? The concept is starting to predict, and the sensory input doesn't match it. Okay, so what do we do? So there's something called a prediction loop. And so essentially, again, this is prediction, right? So what the body is doing is it has this whole big concept that includes all of your senses. And it's going to sort of project this concept, and it's going to predict it, and it's going to run a simulation. And the simulation is the whole concept, the whole kit and caboodle. And in an effort to predict what's going to happen, right? So, for example, if you're, a kid who's being abused, you want to protect yourself before things happen, right? So your body's going to prepare yourself for that based on the context and all that good stuff. So your body's going to run the simulation. It's going to then compare to, the simulation to the outside environment. And then it's going to resolve the errors, right? So in this particular case, we're talking about an abused kid. They're predicting that something's going to happen. Perhaps they're, physically abused, right? A parent. So in one situation, they're ready. The parent is actually physically hurting them. So that matches. Their prediction matches. In another scenario, say at school, they're predicting that maybe the teacher is going to hurt them, but they're not. But that doesn't match. However, their brain is still like in that mode, right? So for us, we have to resolve those errors for them because they're not able to do that. and then it's just a continuous cycle of predicting, simulating, comparing, resolving the errors, predicting again, and so on. So how does the brain make meaning? So again, Dr. Barrett talks about in her work that emotions are goal-based concepts. And so in my head, I sort of feel like goal-based kind of uses interoception and the muscles in your body. Otherwise, it's sort of these are my terms, sort of a categorical concept where you're categorizing things to make sense of the world, but there's no goal. You're not trying to get anywhere, so to speak. So emotion concepts are the goal. What's your goal in the moment? What's your, the interoceptive feelings, and the context. So this is my working definition of meaning. Concepts that involve interoception, context, and goals. And goals are related to survival through allostasis, which is a whole nother topic. But essentially, this predictive processing is really about how does the brain manage what Dr. Barrett calls the body budget. And in other words, how does the brain make sure you have enough glucose in this situation, and enough insulin in this situation, and enough cortisol in this situation? So that's related to allostasis. So the concepts can be individual, specific, or culture specific. Again, these are kind of my terms, right? And are subject to prediction error. So concepts, so there's sort of cultural meaning, right? So if I look at an airplane, right? Weird example, but I look at an airplane, and the cultural meaning is, it's a mode of transportation. It's going to get me from A to B. The individual specific meaning, what do airplanes mean to me? Well, if you're afraid to fly, then they could mean, they could mean something bad, that I'm not safe, or, who's going to take care of me, or something of that nature. So that's, again, where I try to go with the kids, is the individual meaning. And sometimes we talk about the individual meaning versus the cultural meaning, and maybe this particular stimuli, what's the paperclip, has one meaning in one environment and another meaning in another environment, and we have to sort through that. And so meaning has kind of led me all to this idea, the idea of meaning. What do stimuli mean to this individual? So I'll kind of give you an example, and I'll also talk about habit reversal training. So again, we sort of talk about meaning. What I'm doing, the first part of habit reversal training is, the first part of habit reversal training is awareness training. And what you're trying to do is make them aware of the, the environment, the stimuli in the environment that are around when, certain behaviors occur. What I also do, and I'm going to use like behavioral terms, So what I also do with habit reversal training is I do fear extinction. And so what that means is, let's go back to the example of the abusive father and the paperclip, right? So the abusive father is the unconditioned stimuli. The paperclip is the conditioned stimuli. So in fear extinction, if I remove the father, the unconditioned stimuli, and I present only the paperclip, the conditioned stimuli, eventually it won't have that meaning anymore. You know, it'll lose its meaning. It's just a paperclip. And that's fear extinction. And I think, again, you know, I'm a amateur, you know, part-time researcher, neuroscientist, whatever you want to call me. So I don't get a chance to look into, you know, to do the research. But my guess is the reason habit reversal training is so wishy-washy, the literature is like, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, is because we don't do this fear extinction. So yeah, so I do that. And what I'm doing is I'm changing the meaning of the concept of a paperclip. And we talk about the goal, like in the presence of this paperclip, what's your goal? Well, if you're home, the presence of the paperclip may be, I got to get the heck out of here, I'm going to get hurt. But in school, the presence of the paperclip is, oh, I got to keep doing my work, you know, whatever that might be. So I'm going to give you an example of a woman that I worked with. I worked with folks with brain injury. And in a lot of times with folks with brain injury, the biggest factor in any therapeutic gains is self-awareness. In other words, like, a lot of people don't think they need your help, even though they can't walk themselves or whatever. So I was working with this one woman who had she had been abducted and sexually abused as a teenager, and I believe she had been abducted for like 3 days, I think. And eventually she was able to jump out a first-story window and find help. And so when I worked with this person, the sort of traditional, I call it the traditional lens of ABA. Yeah, I could change behavior, but it wasn't quite. It's hard to articulate, but it wasn't quite cutting it, right? And since then, what I've discovered is what traditional ABA is really, really amazing at, what we're like top notch, no one can touch us, is building concepts. We're amazing at building concepts. What we struggle to do is change concepts. And that's what trauma is all about, is changing a concept or adding to a concept to make it, functional. So let's talk about, this person I was working with. So again, we're changing the meaning of the prediction. And if you weren't aware or didn't catch on, predictions and concepts are the same thing, which is again another hard idea to figure out. But prediction, simulation, concept, it's all the same thing. So this person had been abducted in October around Halloween. And so, October, obviously Halloween decorations, windows would often, kind of elicit this concept, right? And then there was a feeling in her legs, which we sort of kind of labeled as like, I need to go, I need to get out of here, right? I'm not safe. And so again, we sort of started with some fear extinction. What she would do is she would be like super close to staff, which because she was afraid of being alone. And so and it was becoming a problem, not only for her, but for other folks in terms of confidentiality and just her independence, right? So where we started is, can you just walk around the corner and come back to me and let's talk about what happened? So she literally just walked around the corner, came right back. What happened? And so we started with the feeling in her body. What's happening? Well, I feel like I want to run and da 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 da. And so that's where we started. We started there, and then we start to build the concept of feeling unsafe. What does that mean? Well, unsafe. I have this feeling when it's October, when I see Halloween decorations, when I feel lonely. At one point, we talked about boiled hot dogs, the smell of boiled hot dogs, because the guy who abducted her would eat boiled hot dogs. So all of these things became the concept of unsafe. And so we had to change that. And we would add to that, right? So I don't have it in the picture, probably should have put it, but staff members, right? So it's October, there's Halloween decorations, someone's cooking a hot dog, there's the window, but wait, there's Sally the staff. And I bring Sally in. Do we trust Sally? Yes, great. And so Sally becomes the concept of feeling safe. So even though we still have October, Halloween decorations, window, hot dog, we now have Sally. We're changing or adding to the concept of feeling unsafe to create a new concept or of safety, right? And so that's where we went. Let's see. So, okay, next secret word.
So our second secret word is habit, HABIT, as we've been talking a lot about the habit reversal training. So make sure to write that one down. Okay, good. Hopefully that's working for you guys. And then I will turn it back over.
Thank you. So let's see.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so that is a lot to digest. And my goal here is to start a conversation to learn more about the, how the brain works and how that creates behavior, how that leads to the muscle movement of behavior, the observable behavior, how the brain predicts and how emotions are made and all that good stuff. So that's all I got for now.
Thank you so much. So you can still hear me, right? We've got a few questions. Okay, good. So let me go to, this was super, super informative. I actually have some things I can relate to this on a personal note as well. But I think the one question I wanted to get to was, could habit reversal training potentially be used for addictive behavior? So I think that's a good concept as far as like OCD or addiction. What would you say about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so when you talk about habits, like, the old school idea of habits is a repetitive movement, but that's not actually where we are now. The automaticity, the automatic, that's a habit. So you could have a habit that happens once a year. So yeah, absolutely, yeah. And if you really think about it, trauma, how trauma presents, it's habits. It's all habits.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense with that connection. Let's see what other questions. Do you integrate zones of regulation vocabulary materials with your trauma treatments?
So I do because oftentimes that's where I consult in the schools, and that's oftentimes where the kid is, where the teachers are, and so I start there for sure. The one thing for me that I try to work around, I don't know if that's the right right language I want to use, but is labeling the feeling in your body as frustrated, disappointed, upset, whatever, as opposed to you're in the yellow zone. One reason is because it won't generalize, or other people in the world don't use yellow zone. They might say, "Ah, you look disappointed." So I try to work with that. But other than that, it's a great tool. It's a fantastic tool. Only thing I'd change is I wouldn't use yellow, green, red zone. I would just use whatever emotional descriptor they have in those zones. But yeah, it's a great tool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's not really specific language that they can identify those.
Well, sorry,
yeah.
I just so when we think about so I actually really enjoy working with people with borderline personality, which there's not a lot of people who say that, but if you really think about borderline personality, they don't have enough language. They don't have enough concepts for the feelings in their body and what's happening, right? They're either angry or ecstatic, right? And so the more, it's actually called emotional granularity, another sort of concept that Dr. Barrett and her folks have put together. Essentially what they're saying is the more words you have to describe your emotions and the context and all that good stuff, the better off you are. But what she's actually saying is the more concepts you have, the easier it is to maneuver in the world.
Well, and kind of going off that, another good question that I saw, let me see if I can find it really quick. Curious about your opinions on applications of this to populations that have less verbal ability.
Yeah, so I do work with some kids who are, I don't work with anybody who's completely nonverbal, but essentially like words and phrases, have very few communicative skills. And so you know, it's not ideal, but you have to take an educated guess. So I'll give you an example. I work with an adult at the moment, and so he has a really hard time with talking about this stuff. And so I go to his mother a lot and say, hey, you know, he was talking about feeling angry. He was in this big residential program that had actually been shut down for some less than cool practices. And he was there at that time. And so I recently just asked the mom, like, hey, can you think of anything that may have come up? And so I start to build the concept for him. And, you know, that can be, you know, a slippery slope, but at the end of the day, it's all educated. You know, I sort of triangulate, well, this person said this and this person said that, they match. And, you know, so it's a lot of talking record reviews, talking with the caregivers, you know, hey, does this make sense to you? That sort of thing. So.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense too. Let's see. We've gotten a lot of really good questions, so I probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to take one or two more. There was one that I thought, would you consider stereotypic behavior to also be a habit since it's something repetitive, or do you kind of put that in its own class of its own? Yeah,
so for habits, it's not about repetition. It's about like how automatic it is, how mindless it is, essentially. So if you bite your fingernails and all of a sudden you look down and like, you know, hey, I didn't know I was doing that. That's a habit. And again, habits can be once a year things. So to answer your question, absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this as kind of a combination of CBD theories with exposure therapies in a sort of way?
Yeah. So I think about exposure therapy as again, so we'll use my abusive dad and the paperclip, right? Exposure therapy, in my mind, is exposing you to the father and working through it. This isn't that. Exposure therapy, like that would be presenting the unconditioned stimuli and you working through that and desensitizing yourself to that. This, again, I sort of use habit reversal because we're not working with the US, we're working with the CS, the conditioned stimuli, which is the concept of an abusive dad.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So I think this is a good one to end on. As far as do you see are kind of the pros and cons of habit reversal training, or maybe like a good use case or story that you've seen how this has really helped one of your clients?
Yeah. So I talked about the woman with brain injury. Trying to think. Yeah. So the same person that I was just talking about, the guy, he has Prader-Willi's, and so we talk a lot about sort of the feeling of needing food and that sort of stuff. Where does that come from? And sometimes, I worked with a guy in the brain injury who I think they removed this may not make sense, but it's like pituitary gland or something like that, where it did like it was his the feeling of hunger. And so we actually worked and he was able to feel full, which was awesome. But he was essentially, it was like a Prader-Willi's case. He just ate and ate and ate and ate. But we changed the meaning of that, of the feeling of being hungry, and where he was able to recognize when he actually felt full. So.
Wow. That I would love to hear more about that. Just diet wise, it would be nice if I myself could feel full more quickly. So I wonder if people could use that for even use cases.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for a whole other hour, but I know we're at time. So I really appreciate all of this information. We've gotten so many questions. Sorry if we weren't able to get to your questions, but we definitely would love to look at follow-ups. If you guys are interested, let us know your feedback when we've got our feedback surveys as well. So thank you so much again for coming on and talking with us about this. It's great to see ABA being applied in these kind of new and exciting ways. And it's definitely something that we are hungry to get training for. So we really thank you again for bringing all this information to us.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And in the feedback survey, I think there's a question about whether or not folks want to get together as a group. This would be a pretty large group, but and just explore this more, and how it
Did you want to talk about what you were thinking with that in that question that in the survey we'll be sending out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know what it'll look like, but if there's enough folks who want to get together and maybe once a month we talk about it, or I don't know what it'll look like, but really based on the response we get. So.
Right. No, I love that idea. I think you'll get a pretty good response based on all the questions and interest we've been getting. So you can count me in. That's definitely entertaining and interesting. So thank you for all of that. All right. So we'll go to our next slide just to make sure everyone knows for the CEU. The 2 secret words again, we said throughout the presentation. If you didn't catch those, let us know in the Q&A and we'll make sure you get those. You'll also get a copy of this recording and a copy of the slides in the follow-up webinar. Also, we'll send you that YouTube link as well, since I know some people had trouble viewing it. So we'll make sure that you guys have access to those materials in the follow-up email. You'll see you should have a handout link that you can use to fill out currently, where you can type in your certificate information and the secret words to get that CEU certificate sent to you. And we'll also have it in case you're watching at a later time, so you can get your CEU as well. And just reach out if you've got any questions, and we can help troubleshoot if you're having any difficulty.